Hi, this is Tanya Allen, and I'm here to talk a little bit about trauma. And this is just an overview, a quick introduction, and you'll learn a lot more about different pieces and elements of trauma throughout this course. I wanted to start with this quote from Dr. Bruce Perry: "The capacity to express full human potential is related to the balance of developmental opportunities and challenges." So for all of us, our brain is developed based off of the opportunities and challenges that are presented to each and every one of us. So for this short piece, we're going to talk about what NME is, the neurosequential model of education, versus NMT, which is the neurosequential model for therapeutics. And we're going to review the 6 R's of developmental and learning environments. We are also going to look at some ways of considering trauma in communities, but in the activities that come separately throughout this course, you will see some different representation from a couple of different communities other than just Bruce Perry's perspective. So the neurosequential model, what is that? So when you think about the word neuro and then think about the word sequential, we're just breaking those two words down. The neurosequential model is really thinking about how, when we talk about neuro, we're talking about the neurons and how brain cells are connected to form pathways. And those pathways allow us to learn, to love, to grow in so many different ways. So that's part of it, that neuro piece. The sequential piece is thinking about how our brain actually develops from the bottom up and thinking about how we organize information in a sequential manner in our brains and how that impacts things. So the timing and nature of our development helps us think about how do we then take this knowledge and this information and apply this to how we set up opportunities for students to learn in our classrooms, when we think about environment, when we think about all those factors that go into it. So as I mentioned a little bit, the neurosequential model of education is what is the NME. Neurosequential model of therapeutics is NMT. And when Dr. Bruce Perry started his work, it was really focused on therapists and looking at those therapeutic settings and taking this brain research and information and integrating it into that. But what he started to get was a lot of inquiry from education settings, similar to what District 287 does and who we serve, and saying, how do we take this information and then work to make it applicable within a school setting so that our kids are getting those opportunities to learn more because we know more as the practitioners. So that's the difference between NME and NMT. So some key things to just note and understand is that our neural networks develop in a use-dependent way. So when you think about that and you think about use-dependent, we talk about, in our language, we talk a lot about school-dependent learners and thinking about how people depend on certain things in order for them to function and to grow. So our brains develop, process, and act on information in a sequential way from the bottom to the top. And that's important to note because sometimes we're asking students to do things that, because there is not development in that lower level, there's not that ability yet to process some of the things that we may be asking students to do or be capable of doing yet. So those are some things that we want to understand. And also that in terms of how we are presenting in that moment, if I am angry, processing with me is going to look very different than when I'm calm. And that's a part of what this model helps to dig into and helps to understand. So one of the things Bruce Perry says is if a child is going to pay attention and listen to what you say, these neural networks have to be relatively well regulated. Obviously, in District 287, we work with students that may not be very well regulated all the time. And now that we're doing distance learning, that's going to be another add-on challenge. So when we think about it, this is just a big heuristic or model of the brain, and thinking about how the brain impacts every area of our functioning, our auditory cortex, the prefrontal cortex, our motor system, all of the things, our speech, what we see, how we react to what we see, all of that is a part of this our brain that we need to be mindful of as we think about how we work with students. We're not going to dig into this quite yet, but there will be some articles as a part of this course that break things down a little bit more, as well as some other video resources. So some key terms to just kind of keep in mind, and if you remember going back to science way back when for some of us, these are some key terms that you may want to note. So the first one is that you'll see abbreviated sometimes in some of the articles is ANS, which stands for the autonomic nervous system. So that's the part of our system that controls our bodily functions, like breathing. You know, we take breathing for granted. We know that we're breathing. We know our heart is beating, but we're not always focused on that. Dopamine, which will be abbreviated sometimes as DA, and that's allowing us to be, that talks about our hormone regulation, and it helps us with our posture and our movement. Norepinephrine carries messages from half of the autonomic nervous system to organs and glands. And thinking about how hunger, mood control, I mean, if you've ever, you know, we joke about being hangry and things like that, but that's part of that system. And then serotonin, thinking about sleep and our limbic system and mood control once again. So those are some key terms that you'll come across as you go through. The one thing that I want to focus on as we end this part of the training is, and just an overview, is the 6 R's. This is extremely important, especially in terms of the work that we do, the 6 R's for developmental and learning environment. Now, we're going to be challenged in distance learning time around what that looks like, but we have ways to address that in terms of how we set things up and how we structure them. But one of the key things, all 6 of them are important, and all 6 of them are things that we may want to think about when we're setting things up, when we're designing a learning environment, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's a distance learning environment. The first one is relational. So there needs to be a sense of safety within the environment. So when you think about when you're in your classroom, what are objects that are in your classroom that may cause a student to not feel safe? Or is it another person in the classroom that makes them not feel safe? When they're at home, what does that look like to have a sense of safety? Because if I'm on an online call, or if I'm on the phone or something else, how do I assure or try to make sure that a student has a sense of safety? The second one is about relevance, and this one is really important. When you think about relevance for that student, this is where we really are needing to think about how we make sure that things are developmentally matched to that child. So sometimes we have activities and ideas and things that sound really great and may be very appropriate for our neurotypical student. But for our students, we need to think about where their development actually is so that we're making sure that the activities are actually relevant and related to how that student can then participate in that activity. The third one is repetitive. So thinking about that predictability, how do we make sure that things are predictable for students so that they know what to expect next? So a lot of times we take the time to think about those things and we say, I think this is pretty predictable. They should know what comes next. How are we making sure that we're setting things up so that it is predictable and that there is a pattern? And do they understand the pattern? How often are you going over the pattern? So just thinking about those types of things, and that when things are not repetitive or predictable, what do you do in those cases to help bring in as much predictability to being unpredictable as you possibly can? So maybe saying, when this goes wrong, we do this. So just thinking about a rainy day. Normally you may say, well, we go to recess every day at 12 o'clock, but today it's raining. So what is that pattern that you established for that student or for that group of students when it's a rainy day? Those are the kinds of things that you want to think about so that the students have that repetition and they have that predictability around their schedules. Rewarding. Who doesn't want to do, who struggles with things that sometimes end up not being enjoyable? Those are things that we all struggle with. And so think about when you're thinking of activities for kids, and it doesn't mean all day is rewarding for them, but finding those times throughout the day that are meaningful and enjoyable for that student, that make them perk up. So just think about how am I building that into my time, into my schedule, into what I'm doing with students. The fifth one is rhythmic. So when we think about activities that connect with our neural patterns, so if I'm at home, one thing I can definitely have access to is my hands, and so maybe you are creating an activity where you're just doing a rhythmic activity to get students' neural patterns connected. So just thinking about how do I introduce rhythm in a simple way. It doesn't need to be complicated. It can be complicated for those that can make it complicated, but think about that student and the group of students you're working with, and make sure that it's something that they can actually do and participate in. But there's that rhythmic piece is important. The last one, and not to make it the least, is respectful. And this is important because the child's family, their cultures, their values are need to be accounted for. And if you haven't done any work around implicit bias, or really looking at culturally responsive teaching or anything related to that, you really need to take time to do that, because a lot of times what we think is respectful is not. And so we need to make sure we're understanding the family's culture, their values, what they do, what they don't do, not asking them to do things that go against their beliefs. When we think about some of the activities that we do, and some good examples are always our holidays. I mean, we often talk about the holidays and not thinking about families celebrating very different holidays than what we may celebrate. And so thinking about how am I making sure that I'm respectful to that family's culture and their values, especially as we think about what's left coming up in the year. And even as you plan ahead for any other future school years, just think about what that means for those families when we're not accounting for or bringing meaning to those things that are meaningful for them. So I just want to help you to think about those things as we get started in this course. There will be some different videos from Dr. Bruce Perry and from some other experts in the field that I hope that you will watch and think critically about what you're actually learning about through these videos, because there's a lot of good, rich information that can help you as you work with students on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.